Greetings. It is now the third week of class, and I hope that all of you got my message that we're only doing the Gimbutas reading this week. I didn't have the other reading up yet, and some of you started sending your reflections to me on just the Gimbutas reading, so I decided to remove the other one and just have you do this reading. The two readings that I was going to assign you, they did go together and they added a little bit of context to the assignment, but this is fine. We'll just focus on this one. So to recap on what we did last week before we move on, we talked about Ruth Benedict and the chrysanthemum and the sword. Benedict had been asked to do a study on Japanese culture during World War II, largely because, as Benedict described, Americans were confounded by apparent contradictions in Japanese culture. When we talked about how today, when we look back at a reading like this one, it's considered inappropriate for an anthropologist to work on behalf of a war effort, and how all of us are expected to not do work that harms our research participants. So Benedict argued that Japanese approaches to war are inherently different than the approaches of Americans because of the way that we understand what war is and what we are fighting for, and we imagine those things to be inherently different. Benedict framed Americans as approaching war, interestingly, from a position of feeling obligated to fight. It's something that when our nation goes into a war, we don't choose it. It's something that we kind of got pulled into. We don't have a choice. We just have to go and fight this war now. This is not what we would do if left to our own devices. On the other hand, she framed the Japanese as approaching war from a position of being entirely of control of the circumstances at all times. For example, minimizing accidents and framing the deaths of their own soldiers as part of a grander strategy. Ultimately, Benedict claims that the Japanese viewed war as a war of spirit, and they believed that they would win the war because their national spirit was the greatest. Many of you quickly and thoroughly pointed out that in spite of Benedict's spoken commitment to Boasian cultural relativism, that this study was marred by a great deal of ethnocentrism and was written from a perspective that we learned to call armchair anthropology. It was clear to the class that there were significant issues with trying to do an ethnographic study of Japan without going to Japan. Benedict herself acknowledged this, but she felt that the time that was spent with Japanese Americans mitigated this. And as you all pointed out, we can expect that many of her Japanese American interlocutors were probably not impartial to Japan, and they likely had feelings about Japan from their own experience that would lead or that would not grant Benedict access to a more thorough and complete view of Japanese society. At the end of class, we noted that while Benedict framed U.S. and Japanese approaches to war as being deeply alien to each other, the Ilongot people, whose perspective we read about earlier this semester, whose lands were the site of heavy fighting during World War II, had their own approach to war, and perhaps they did not see the Japanese and American approaches to war as being as different from each other in the ways that mattered most to the Ilongot people. So good job with the Benedict reading. Y'all saw the things that I hope that you would. So moving on to Gimbutas. I'm going to say, first of all, that the reading that I removed was about Aztec society and Aztec approaches to war, and particularly the way that Aztecs and Spanish conquistadors viewed each other when they ended up fighting in the 16th century. But we'll go ahead and move on to Europe with Gimbutas. The reading that I assigned you is an interesting one. It's interesting to me. It may not be immediately obvious why I assigned it to you for a course on war and society. Maybe it is. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the author and who she was and what her greater argument as a scholar was, to try and contextualize this reading a little bit. Rita Gimbutas is not talked about as much today in cultural anthropology, though she does come up sometimes. However, her theories are still central to many important debates in archaeology, linguistics, and in genomic studies. Gimbutas was a Lithuanian scholar who fled to the United States immediately after World War II. She was a remarkable talent as both an archaeologist and a linguist. I don't remember exactly how many languages she spoke, but it was a lot. and it included some ancient extinct languages. So in her early career, she made a name for herself just in her ability to translate ancient documents and records that nobody else could read. And she ended up being hired by Harvard University for exactly this role. And before we continue, I want to say um, that I think I need to point out a few more things about the context of her study. This deals with ancient population migrations and such, and like I said before, it may not be immediately obvious how all this relates, but I think that understanding these things will be helpful. So, like others that we have read, Gimbutas was and continues to be a controversial scholar, but it was for reasons that were pretty different from some of the other scholars that we've read. I think that it's fair to point out that it is almost impossible to be a scholar who deals with subjects such as violence and war without being controversial, regardless of what side you're taking on these things. So, anyway, Gimbutas, she became established as a scholar of European prehistory, particularly in Eastern Europe, but European prehistory in general. She got involved in some archaeological excavations. She started to direct them, and she became a major expert in a period of prehistory that we refer to as Neolithic Europe. And she also was very well versed in the transition from Neolithic Europe into what we call the European Bronze Age. And I should point out that with regard to this particular subject, even her fiercest critics would argue that Gimbutas probably knew more about the material culture of these people in this time than anyone else on Earth. While she was working on these things, there were a couple of issues that were being heavily debated by anthropologists, linguists, historians, and others. Today, today a large portion of Earth's population speak languages that are associated with what is called the Indo-European language family. The Indo-European language family includes the vast majority of languages that are spoken in Europe today, Romance languages like Spanish and French, Germanic languages like English and Dutch, Slavic languages like Russian, some other languages as well like Greek, the Gaelic languages like Irish and Welsh, and ancient languages you may be familiar with like Latin. The Indo-European language family also includes a lot of languages that are spoken in Central and Southern Asia, languages including Hindi and Bengali, also the ancient language Sanskrit. Persian languages such as Pashto and Farsi belong to the Indo-European language family. The Kurdish languages are Indo-European, as are several languages that are spoken in the Hindu Kush region in eastern Afghanistan. Though today we tend to see these regions as belonging to some very different religious and cultural continua, such as Christianity in Europe, Islamic religion and culture through the Persian regions, Hindu culture in South Asia. It was different a while back. And if you look at the ancient religions that were pre-Christian, pre-Islam, of these people, there were profound similarities in the ancient religion of the people in all of these regions where Indo-European languages are spoken today. So if you go back 100 years or so in our own society to a time when this observation was well established and everyone pretty much agreed that at some point in the distant past there must have been a single culture somewhere thousands of years ago whose religion and language somehow ended up deeply influencing people from all the way from far Western Europe all the way to Central and South Asia. How how exactly this happened became a matter of extreme debate at that time. Uh, this hypothetical ancient culture was named the Indo-European culture, and their language was called Proto-Indo-European. Who were these people? Where did they live? How did this happen? A lot of theories arose about this. And as we might expect, these theories became heavily laden with nationalistic and sometimes racist interests. And this continues today. There continue to be people, especially in both Western Europe and India, who are deeply, deeply invested in proving that their land and their ethnicity are the home to these ancient Indo-European people. Um, Most contemporary scientists would say that both of those theories are very unlikely, but they remain political, and some people feel very emotional about these issues. I'm going to put that out there and just say that that's a thing that still exists. Um, One of the primary theories that has been popular over the years is what was called the Anatolian hypothesis, which is that the Indo-European languages and culture and the culture who developed them lived in what is in the present day Turkey, the nation of Turkey, and it is believed that agriculture, true large-scale agriculture, and this event that we call the agricultural revolution began there, and it spread from that area through a process of cultural diffusion. This would have been happening between 8 and 9,000 years ago, and that theory posits that as the agricultural revolution happened, starting in what is now Turkey, and as farming technology spread throughout the world, the Indo-European languages traveled with those farming technologies. I should also say that the culture that developed at that time, between 8 and 9,000 years ago, with the spread of farming technologies, is what we call now Neolithic Europe. So that was the Anatolian hypothesis, and it was one of the primary ones that was popular through over the past 100 years. Um, so in the 1950s, uh, Maria Gimbutas proposed her own theory from what happened, and it was different. And again, some of the other theories that were popular, the Anatolian hypothesis actually became most popular a little later in the 20th century. Before then, a lot of people were arguing for either, you know, an origin for this Indo-European culture, either in Europe or in India. Some people thought maybe it was in present-day Iran. But Gimbutas proposed her own theory. It's called the Kurgan hypothesis. And I mentioned that Gimbutas is controversial in a lot of ways. But even when scientists were debating this, her development of the Kurgan hypothesis was not in and of itself particularly controversial. It was treated like a reasonable hypothesis and debated as such on its own merits. Uh, that's not the part of it that made her particularly controversial. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So the reading that I assigned to you was basically a distillation of the Kurgan hypothesis. She published this in 1993, very late in her life, a good 40 years after she developed the hypothesis. And this hypothesis was still being debated at that time, and she basically, in this paper, is just trying to explain it in a very condensed fashion in a journal length article to try to make it easy for everyone to understand. So I'm going to go over this theory, how she determined it, and how it's relevant to our class. So according to Gimbutas, the people of Neolithic Europe did not speak Indo-European languages, and their culture did not feature many of these elements that were shared in this now observable ancient continuum from Europe to India, whose most obvious modern day remnant is the speaking of related languages that derive from this ancient Proto Indo European language. So she identified the source of Indo European culture in a region that we call the Eurasian steppe, particularly in an area in some grasslands north of the Black Sea in modern day Ukraine and Western Russia. Through a means that is debatable, this group of people who were pastoralists, they herded animals, they became some of the earliest adopters, if they were not, and they were possibly the originators themselves, of three major technological advances. They started smelting bronze, they domesticated the horse, and perhaps even invented the wheel, and from that, the chariot. And if they didn't invent these things themselves, they were some of the very earliest people to really adopt and use these things a lot. But some people think they did it themselves. Having basically started the Bronze Age, And having developed a fast and formidable form of technological dominance, these people, according to the Kurgan hypothesis, basically raced across Europe, Central and South Asia, and conquered it all very forcefully. And this was the beginning of the Bronze Age in these places. Uh, Relatively small groups of people were able to establish themselves as chieftains, and they subdued Neolithic cultures everywhere they went. And over the duration of a couple thousand years, Indo-European or Indo-European influenced culture was dominant pretty much everywhere that we see these languages being spoken today. So that's her theory. Why did it become controversial, or why did she become controversial? There's one, there is one element of it, of this, which of course, anytime a scholar in pretty much any academic field introduces a new idea, there are a lot of people who are going to argue with it or attack it because they're invested in their careers may be invested in another idea, a previous idea, or a different idea. Um, and that's what it was at first with Gimbutas and the Kurgan hypothesis, but it started to get deeper as her career advanced. It should be said that after she published her argument, she provided some pretty strong evidence for it from her archaeological excavations, and it actually did become the dominant theory, though many people debated various aspects of it. Uh, she did establish, though, that it's very likely that Indo-European culture and language developed in the Eurasian steppe and started to spread one way or another over 6,000 years ago. She thought perhaps 6,500 years ago. That basic aspect of her theory became pretty mainstream in the mid 20th century. So she made a strong argument. Those aspects, the homeland of the people in the time they existed, became mainstream. However, even people who did accept the Kurgan hypothesis for those parts did not believe that it happened in the way that she said that it did. Many European scholars, for example, strongly preferred to believe that their language, culture, and technology, those things had spread through adaptation and not through force, through cultural diffusion. After the 1950s, Gimbutas' career made a shift, and this is when she became much more controversial, and scientists started to reject most of her arguments while continuing to accept these core parts of her Kurgan hypothesis. Gimbutas endured a lot of sexism. In the 40s and 50s, while she was working at Harvard, she was underpaid and she could not get a professorship, even though she had a PhD and published one of the most influential and important studies that was ever written in the field, in her field, and this continues to be the case. Um, Harvard refused to hire her as anything other than a contract scholar interpreting documents. And this was entirely due to the fact that she was a woman. She couldn't even go to the library at Harvard without a male escort going with her. And fortunately for her, after this publication, she was contacted by UCLA, University of California in Los Angeles, and was offered a professorship with tenure there. So she moved to California and took up her professorship, and with the academic freedom she was granted, she started to speak much more openly about how she came to her conclusions. Gimbutas began to make some big and detailed arguments about the cultures of these ancient people. And to put her argument succinctly, her colleagues and critics argued that she was starting to make assertions about things that she could not possibly know about, and thus what she was doing was unscientific. She started to write books and articles and make presentations about what these people were like. Who were the Neolithic people of Europe? What were they like? What were the Indo-European people like? And she started trying to reconstruct the religious practices and beliefs and the social structure of these peoples. And like I said, many of her peers thought that this was unscientific and that she was making assertions that were not falsifiable and were basically creative speculation on her behalf. Um, there's more than that, too, though. Um, it was also the case that some of her peers did not like the argument that she was making as she started to describe these people and what she thought they were like and how she thought that this event took place. Gimbutas was a very intuitive person. People who participated on archaeological excavations with her noted that she would do things like she would start walking around the site as it was being excavated, and she would say, "This is where this thing happened. This is where the temple would have been. The people would have come from this way or that way, and they would have walked down this corridor, and they would have conducted the ceremonies over here in this place, and that this was there and that was here." And a lot of her colleagues didn't like this, and they would say, "How could you possibly know that? You're just projecting your imagination onto things that are completely unprovable." Um, and it really got that way when she started trying to describe some of the details that led to her development of the Kurgan hypothesis. She argued that Bronze Age technologies and Indo European language did not come into these places peacefully. They did not come through cultural diffusion. Rather, a violent, warlike group invaded these places, conquering them, killing people in mass, entirely disrupting their way of life, and imposing their own culture on these people. At the very beginning of the article that I had you read, she argues that she imagines this event as having looked a lot like the European conquests that took place during the colonial era more recently, such as the colonization of the Americas by Europeans, with a process of a relatively short period of time through which the local population was subjected to genocide, subjectification, and the culture of their colonizers imposed by force. She recognized several cultural elements that she rooted in the original Indo European culture in Bronze Age Europe and other Bronze Age areas that were influenced by the Indo Europeans. She recognized some cultural elements there that she said were not present in the Neolithic ancient world prior to Indo European conquest. The caste system, she said the Indo Europeans were a caste based society. Extreme violence. She said that the people conquered by the Indo Europeans were not warrior societies. And this is the big one. The institution of what we recognize today as patriarchy, a system of patriarchy. Um, and from this patriarchy, the whole range of subsequent bigotries and violences that are still observable in the modern world. She noticed when she excavated that there was, she excavated these places and saw layers, 8,000 years ago was down here, and then above it there's another layer of 7,000 years ago, and then 6,000 years ago, and that was how it worked. She noticed that there was this moment in the history of these sites when major cultural transformation occurred. And it was Neolithic Europe where she saw signs of egalitarianism displayed, and how things like how people were buried and how grave goods were distributed. She saw the evidence of the veneration of women, and perhaps the worship of an ancient supreme goddess, as displayed in the iconography of the things that she excavated. And from this, she imagined that these societies were much more egalitarian than what we see today, with much more gender equality. And all of a sudden, she observed a tremendous mass of weaponry, swords and daggers and spears and things that did not exist with such abundance prior to this moment in time. Um, Hilltop fortresses, the burials started to change. She started seeing that men were buried differently than women. Warrior chieftains were buried differently than everyone else was buried. They would be buried with their wealth and their swords. Significant social equality was suddenly apparent. If slavery existed in the societies prior to Indo Europeanization, it was not the same kind of um, abject slavery like what we understand slavery to be today. Gimbutas saw these things as having come in with Indo European invasion. Patriarchy, the pantheon of ancient Indo European religion was much more patriarchal. It was headed by big, violent, powerful male gods who kill and rape. Elements of this Indo European society are very apparent in some subsequent cultures. Ancient Sparta, the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons who invaded ancient Britain. These societies all carried significant Indo-European elements uh, in their pantheons, their religions and culture. And a lot of this did not sit very well with her peers. We talked in a previous class about how important the notion of progress is in our society. Other than the scientific argument that she was speculating about things that were not falsifiable, things that she couldn't know, there were parts of her argument that people didn't like, and it was long popular and continues to be so in our society to believe in progress. We believe that the innovations of our society, things like technological developments and the development of our own, I say our, referring to myself, European culture, represented things that should be known as steps ahead in the world, a reduction in chaos and primitivity. And Gimbutas was arguing counter than that. She was arguing essentially that much of the world, including European society, was much more peaceful and much less chaotic prior to this event of Indo-Europeanization, and that these technological advancements and hierarchical systems that were introduced in this moment were actually the introduction of kinds of suffering and violence in these societies that did not exist there before, at least not on that scale. And that many institutions in the modern world are in a lot of ways the cultural heritage of this moment in time. And much of how we understand the notion of something like warriordom is not something universal to humanity, but is something that was glorified and imposed by this very specific group of people at a very specific point in time. Um, and I should say also that people didn't like this aspect of her model because it implied some amount of population turnover. People in a lot of places, like Europe, like to imagine that they are the undisputed indigenous people of that land, that they are the inheritors of a very, very deep history and prehistory in that area, a long and unbroken line. And the Indo-European invasion model suggests that a significant portion of the population of what Gimbutas called Old Europe would have been replaced by invaders from somewhere else, and that people who look like me with mostly European ancestry are probably descended at least as much from these people as we are from the people who lived in Europe before they showed up. So, for many years, Gimbutas has been remembered as both a skilled archaeologist who's responsible for identifying the source of many of the world's major languages, who has been seen, unfortunately, as this kind of kooky feminist who invented a silly field called feminist archaeology and who mobilized and made popular with some groups a bunch of unfalsifiable theories about human prehistory. With that said, a major revolution has taken place in genomics over the past decade, and we've developed the ability to sequence and study very ancient DNA, learning things about the ancient world that were once considered unknowable. Some landmark studies that were done just a few years ago, sequencing ancient DNA, um, have now proven almost to the point of being beyond any doubt whatsoever that the migrations of the Neolithic Bronze Age transition happened pretty much exactly the way that Gimbutas described. And it is so definite that some of Gimbutas' harshest critics, who maintained the most forceful arguments that she was wrong about these things, had to publish statements after this recent study where they conceded that Gimbutas had been right about pretty much everything. And she came to those conclusions through her intuition and the stories that she weaved together through looking in extreme detail of material culture over time. And some of the cultural arguments that she made remain unprovable. However, she continues to be proven correct whenever any of her theories becomes provable. Uh, is the world today in all the ways that it understands things like violence, manhood, war, and warriordom, disproportionately influenced by the beliefs and culture of a conquering people from the Eurasian steppe thousands of years ago. Gimbutas would say yes. Um, my opinion, my opinion is that uh, some influence is definitely there. Um, I'm going to go ahead and quit there. I'm trying to keep these lectures under 30 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and stop, and I look forward to seeing all of you on Friday. Take care.